All right, everyone. Welcome to your on Book Show on this Sunday. It's Sunday, yes, Sunday morning here in California. As you know, as those of you who follow the show at least know, I'm in California for the next week or so. We'll be doing shows from my hotel room, and this is it. Oh, there's the pillow. You can see a pillow on the other side there. All right. Thanks everybody for joining me tonight. Thank you. This morning, it looks like we got a bunch of people already on the chat getting engaged. Today we continue to discuss some of the implications for my discussion with Sam Seder on the building collapse in Florida. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about some other issues as well. And we'll talk about withdrawal from Afghanistan. We'll talk about, actually, we'll start with Branson going into space. I don't know why the intro music, I played the intro music. I'm not sure why the intro music is not playing onto YouTube. Okay, I'll have to work on that. There's something in the settings here that is not connected to... all right, I'll figure it out. Not connected to the YouTube stream, so it's only going to. I'm catching it on the podcast, but not on the YouTube stream. So we'll figure it out. All right. You're already asking questions about Afghanistan. We'll get to Afghanistan, I promise. That'll be at the end, and I will answer all your questions about who is losing, what counts as losing, what is losing, all of that kind of stuff we will talk about, so don't worry. All right. Yes, Stephanie, you're on YouTube. You sound different. I hope you're all right. Yes, I'm fine. I sound different. Different location, different mic, different setup, different everything. I'm fine. Let's see. It's 3 a.m. here. Australia. But Corey couldn't get to sleep, so Corey's here. Okay, I don't see Alejandrina, but you all know the rules or the goal. The goal is to raise at least $400 per show, and you can do that by using Super Chat. All right, Mellow, I've noticed this, so I saw Mellow. I think the difference is sitting versus standing, being in my own office versus being in a hotel room with some echoing. In a hotel room, I'm trying not to yell, trying not to be loud because I'm worried about sound leakage and other, going into the corridor and neighbors and everything. In my own office, I don't care. It's just me, and I'm standing. I think when I stand, I have more. It's more like I'm giving a talk, so there's more energy. There's more. It's interesting psychologically how it works. When I'm sitting, it's more like an interview. It's more mellow. It's less passion. So it is what it is. You get different. I mean, there are people who by far prefer it when I'm sitting and when it's more mellow and when I'm just talking like this. And there are other people who prefer it, when I'm much more passionate and a little bit louder and am on my feet. All right, Laura, I'll try to pay attention when you're making jokes and not being serious. All right, so that explains kind of the more mellow tone is not because I'm down. It's not because anything's going on. It's not because I'm not feeling well. It's just because I'm in a hotel room, trying not to make too much noise, and I'm sitting down. It's truly fascinating how just sitting versus standing changes your energy level, your tone, how you speak. So, all right, I hope the sound is good. I think the sound should be good. Maybe it's a little too loud. So let me see if I can lower the volume a little bit. Okay, that should be good. Let me know if that's too low, but I lowered the sound a little bit on the mic. All right, let's start yelling you on and start super chat and start super chat, guys. Yes, where is the super chat, people? You can support the show. Lots of ways to support the show. First of all, like the show. Before you leave, press the like button if you liked it. I don't expect you to like the show if you don't like it, but please like it if you do. And of course, you can support the show on yourunbookshow.com/support. You can support the show on Patreon or Subscribestar. But the best way to support the show, if you're listening live, if you're on YouTube right now, is to use the super chat. You can ask questions. You can interact. And it's always exciting to see the numbers going up. So, we've got 2 people from in Sydney, Australia, listening right now live. On a per capita basis, right now, I think Australia is leading, particularly if you adjust for time, for the time of day. So, got some committed listeners in Australia. That's a lot of fun. It's good to know. It's good to know. Yes, and big numbers are fun, but you shouldn't just talk about big numbers. You should actually engage in contributing big numbers, and that's how we get to the fun of the big numbers. Oh wait, I have to remember to solve the problem of how to get the intro music onto YouTube. I'll solve that by the show tomorrow. Okay, there will be. I expect there'll be a show tomorrow. Probably Pacific time, maybe 4 o'clock Pacific time, so it'll be around there. All right. Oh, we've got one from the Netherlands. All right, I'd expect more from Europe right now, given that we're doing this fairly early, but fairly early in the day, so it's still a reasonable time for Europeans to be listening. All right, let's see. Where are we? Let's start with Richard Branson. That's exciting. So Richard Branson launched himself into space today. First civilian, if you will, to go into space on a, I guess it was a kind of a plane, went up and landed. Incredibly cool. Completely privately funded. They launched off of from New Mexico in the United States. And there we go. Florida Nick is starting us off with $2. We could make this a $2 day, and we could just get all of you to just do $2 and $2 and see how much money we can raise at $2 a pop. So keep it up, Nick. Thank you, Florida Nick. So here we are. We've got a first man in space, billionaire in space in 8 days or in 7 days. I think Jeff Bezos is going up into space on Blue Origin. And what's interesting there is there's some really healthy competition between Blue Origin and Virgin Galactica, I guess it's called. And so far, right, we've seen the Virgin as won because Branson got into space first. But it's interesting because Blue Origin announced that Jeff Bezos would be launching in 7 days. And Virgin was supposed to launch just a test flight with some pilots today. But Richard Branson jumped in, basically announcing that he wouldn't let Jeff Bezos be the first man into space. He wanted to be the first one into space. So some healthy competition there, and therefore he joined the flight today and went into space. And now there's competition about what you define as space. It turns out that Branson went something like 84 kilometers up. And the United States defines the beginning of space at something like 84 kilometers. But the international body, some international body that regulates this stuff, defines going up into space as 100 kilometers. Jeff Bezos is going to go with the 100 kilometers. So the whole week, Blue Origin has been poo-pooing the achievement of Richard Branson by saying he's not really going to space. It doesn't really count. Zero gravity is much low. It's going to be a much shorter time in zero gravity, and it's not really a rocket. It's an airplane, and so there's this competition going on between the two from a marketing perspective, from a technology perspective, from a timing perspective. And I find it cool to see. I think the idea of private individuals making it into space at their own expense is truly thrilling and exciting, and proves that even big capital ventures, even big ventures that take a lot of money can be done by private enterprise. That you don't need government to initiate every advancement. You don't need government research, government money, government funding to move humanity forward. It's actually pretty rare and pretty unusual that government is funding things that actually all the way push us forward. They might fund some of the basic research because they're the only funders today of basic research. They crowded out everybody else. But in terms of taking that basic research and turning it into something that is useful for human life, it's not what government does. And it's not what government is capable of. And even if the government stepped out of basic research, it's not like there'd be a hole there. And I think what Branson and Bezos are doing is showing us that private enterprise, private ambitions, private selfish, self-interested interests can move civilization forward. And space is the next frontier. It's phenomenal to see us breaking into space and what human beings can achieve and what is possible. I think every time these guys launch rockets into space and ultimately make that trip to Mars and put humans on Mars, these are massive achievements for human beings, for the future, for the advancement of technology, for the advancement of human ability, and it truly is fantastic. And it's a slap in the face to the statists who again think that only with government can we achieve anything. Victor Baratti, thank you. He's continuing on the $2 a day. Christopher is going up to the $5.50 Canadian, which is what, $4 or for something US. So thanking Christopher for your support. I really appreciate support at whatever level you guys choose to support it. I appreciate it, whether it's $2, £2, $5.50 Canadian, whatever, is really great. So Branson is the first billionaire. Well, he's the first civilian to fly into space in a privately funded civilian aircraft, and that is truly fantastic. The beginning of space tourism, the beginning, and look, people are going to complain. Oh, only billionaires can do this. Only billionaires can. Yes, that's right. But what's the point from the perspective of the people? The point is that billionaires are first adapters of very, very expensive technology. But what happens over time? Because billionaires are willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing this, because Branson has been willing to spend $1 trillion in developing this technology, that technology is going to get cheaper. The more billionaires and the more gazillionaires or whatever the level of wealth they have. Sorry, Branson has spent $1 billion, not $1 trillion. He's not a trillionaire. $1 billion to develop this technology. But the more they're willing to spend their own wealth, the more people are willing to pay Blue Origin and Virgin to take them into space, the more capital these companies have to develop this technology, to expand this technology, to make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. One day, it won't cost $100 million to go into space. It'll cost $100,000 to go into space, and a lot more people will be able to afford it. And as that becomes more prevalent and more people are willing to pay $100,000 to go into space, the price will drop even further to $10,000, and ultimately, it'll become affordable for many of us to go into space. And this is how advanced technology develops. This is how, the first laser printers were fabulously expensive. Only corporations could afford them. And as corporations were the first adopters and bought a bunch of them, providing capital, providing incentive to laser printing companies to develop the laser printer, the price of laser printing dropped dramatically. Same happened with computers. The same, remember the supercomputer? Remember mainframes? Remember mini computers that digital had? Only big corporations could afford that. But as they developed that, the technology developed, the incentives were created until we got the PC, until we got personal computers. So all of this allows for a dramatic decline in costs and brings that technology to all of us. So it's great news. It's a great moment, I think, for private space travel, for innovation, for private enterprise into other planets, and I'm excited by it. It's another step towards the ultimate colonization of Mars, and it would be phenomenal if the colonization of Mars happens by private entrepreneurs rather than by governments planting flags, but it's by entrepreneurs figuring out how to make money colonizing Mars, how to make money, how to create wealth, how to create value by colonizing Mars. That is the goal. That is the achievement. And of course, by wealth creating, by mining, by expanding the human scope of what is possible. I don't know what it's going to look like, and I don't know what kind of values are going to be produced, and I don't know what kind of wealth is going to produce, but this is great. And this is part of the beauty of what's happening is that, people are complaining about billionaires not paying enough taxes. Good. Because it allows them to keep the wealth so that they can invest in these kind of companies. Government would squander this money, would waste this money, would throw it down, flush it down the toilet onto infrastructure projects of roads to nowhere, bridges to nowhere. Wait and see what this infrastructure build is actually got inside of it. All the pork, all the goodies, all the little favors to different districts and different senators and different House members to basically bribe them into voting for it. Please, federal government, don't invest in infrastructure, and let private entrepreneurs invest in infrastructure, and look what happens. We might go to Mars. So I celebrate the fact that Elon Musk and who's been in the news, Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson are not paying their, quote, fair share of taxes. They're paying as little taxes as possible. They're keeping the wealth and using that wealth to advance civilization, using that wealth to move us forward. And yes, there are poor people in the world, but you know what? I'd rather see Branson's wealth going to creating jobs, going to moving civilization forward, going to new technologies, new achievements, new value creations that will ultimately create jobs and lower poverty, ultimately. But in the short run, the left and the right, I think, are going to complain bitterly about, what's the point? We're going to Mars when there's so many problems over here at Earth. We should be confiscating all their wealth and redistributing it. Who the hell are you to decide how an individual should use his wealth, what his value should be? I love it that these guys, all these rich guys, are so ambitious when it comes to space travel, ambitious when it comes to how to use their wealth. And it's moving civilization forward, whether it's your particular values or not. That's the beauty of a free market. It doesn't have to be yours. It's not democratic. It's not what the majority wants. Mars looks a lot like Utah, MH08 says. Yeah, maybe we'll discover life on Mars constitutes. Maybe Mars is the planet Mormons go to when they die, and that's why it looks like Utah. For God's chosen people to choose Utah as the place to live in, particularly the flats and the desert in Utah. All right. So I'm excited about Branson going to space. A week from now, we'll see Jeff Bezos going to space. So here's the question. How are we going to keep this space travel safe? How are we going to make sure that these spaceships don't blow up? Well, one way to keep it safe is to have the guy who's spending all the billions building these space rockets fly like the first one. Like, they don't want to die. So you know that Branson and Bezos have put enough safety protocols into their spaceships to make sure that they don't get killed on their initial flights, right? So they have a very selfish incentive to make these spaceships, to make these planes, to make these rockets safe. All right, so that's one reason why they make it safe. What are some other reasons why, as we develop this technology, launch people into space? And look, there are probably going to be accidents. One in X number of these rockets, spaceships will cause some deaths. We've seen this in the past. We've seen this with NASA. We saw it with the space shuttle. We saw it with the Apollo program. There is no such thing as zero accidents. There's no such thing as 100% safety. And this is the transition into the topic of safety, right? So there are always going to be accidents. And when they have accidents on these spacecraft, what are we going to do? We're going to regulate it. This government is going to step in and try to choke this and try to regulate it. And my view is that'll slow down, that'll reduce our ability to go to space. The beauty right now is there's very little regulation. These individuals are taking risks. They know the risk that they're taking. They're calibrating the risk-return trade-off for themselves based on their own personal values rather than some bureaucrats. And by doing that, they're advancing technology further. They're moving the world further ahead. I mean, it's amazing to me that it's okay for the government to calibrate safety, like in Apollo, because it's for the common good. So if a few people die for the common good, that's okay. We realize you have to take some risks for the common good with public money. We can't have a 100% safety record when we do Apollo, but we got to get to the moon because JFK said we got to get to the moon, and JFK was speaking for the common good of the American people. So it's okay if a few people die for the common good. But when it's individuals making decisions for themselves about the risk that they're willing to take or not to take, that's unacceptable. Then it's the job of government to make sure that it's 100% safe. Because why? Because their activities are not important. In a sense, their activities are fundamentally immoral because they're just pursuing their own values. They're being selfish. They're being self-interested in pursuing their own values, in wanting to go into space, in doing it for the fun and the enjoyment of it. There's no common good here. And it's the job of the government to protect us, to protect even people who know, to protect even knowledgeable people, even people who can make assessment of risk for themselves. To hell with all that. We, the central planners, we, the philosopher kings, will decide for you what is the appropriate risk level you take. So one reason the space travel are relatively safe is because the entrepreneurs themselves are flying. The pilots are flying. Pilots, very knowledgeable people, know a lot about the technology, know a lot about these aircrafts, these rockets. They don't want to die. Maybe they push pressure on the company to make it safe. What else? Well, most of these companies don't want to kill their customers, don't want to kill their pilots. Most of the people working on these projects have a sense of pride about them. Now, there are going to be some charlatans, and we'll get to charlatans and how to deal with charlatans afterwards. But fundamentally, most people out there don't want to build buildings that collapse. They don't want to build cars that blow up. They don't want to build spacecraft that implode. They have pride in what they do. They have pride in what they create. Now, they all know, and this is really important, they all know there's risk. We all know there's risk. I'll get to other factors. Don't worry. We're just going through these. We're not going through all of them. We're taking one step at a time. I see already people are complaining. But of course, the way to get my attention is not to complain because I can't read the chat. I'm looking at the camera. I don't have big monitors here where I can see the chat while I'm looking at the camera. So if you want to get my attention, you have to ask a super chat question or make a super chat comment, and then I'll be able to respond to what you're saying specifically. So people have an incentive because they care. People are putting up their own money, so they want to make it good, particularly early on. The charlatans don't have enough money to build shoddy spacecraft. Now, as it gets cheaper, we can talk about that. So, in a wealthy society, for expensive products, people are putting out their own money, and they're taking on risk. They know that there's going to be risk, but they calibrate the risk with the return, with the value that they're being created, and what you get is good products. What you get is safety. All right, but how do we, once these things get cheaper, once more people are going into space, who has an incentive to monitor this so that we don't have charlatans? Who has an incentive to monitor this, that nobody's cutting corners, to cut costs, to increase revenue? Because at some point this is going to become a profit-seeking enterprise, and maybe some of these companies will become more risky in order to increase their profit margins so that they can lower price, and ultimately get more people to fly, and they'll take on more risk short term with the idea that they'll make money short term and to hell with the long run. How do we prevent the irrational? Because a rational businessman would say, I need to be careful, because if there is an accident, the likelihood that I go out of business is very high. Nobody's ever going to fly with me again. And so what is it that would drive them to be more safe? Well, one is, again, a rational businessman, rational decision maker, the knowledge that accidents work against you, that accidents will destroy you, that accidents are going to cause people not to want to fly with you. And as a consequence, you lose customers. But what about short-term irrational businessmen that just want to get the money out? Well, this is where I think there are two types of financial products that, and this is the beauty of markets, because this is not centrally planned, this is just something that evolved. There are two financial type of institutions that are motivated to supervise you, that are motivated to send inspectors in to check on you, to make sure that you're not running high risks. The one is kind of obvious. The one is what you'd anticipate, which is insurance companies. Every one of these flights is insured. Indeed, people take out insurance when they fly. The company's taking out insurance because they might be sued. The company takes out insurance because the rocket might be lost, and there are millions and millions of dollars at stake. And indeed, I wouldn't get on a spaceship or on an airplane if they were in a free market, not today, but in a free market, unless there was insurance. The market would demand that these companies carry insurance. And part of the reason is not that I would get compensated afterwards, because if I'm dead, what difference does it make? I guess my family would benefit, but that's not the reason to do it. The primary purpose of insurance, from the perspective of the user of a product, is that the insurance company doesn't want to take the losses. In a free market, you could expand this to healthcare as well. In a free market, an insurance company would very much be involved in providing you with incentives to engage in preventive care so that you don't get sick. Because the worst thing that can happen to an insurance company is you getting sick. And the sicker you get, the more money they lose. And if they can incentivize you not to get sick, they can incentivize you to exercise, or incentivize you to eat well, or incentivize you to pre-screen, to go into get pre-screened for different diseases. The less cost that they incur, the less catastrophic costs. For example, insurance companies in healthcare would have an incentive to have PP&E, to buy vaccines, to encourage you to take vaccines. So there's a massive incentive for insurance companies to do the work, to inspect buildings, to inspect aircraft, to inspect rockets, to make sure that they don't get stuck with massive liabilities because something went wrong. So they have an incentive to, quote, regulate, to create standards, to send in supervisors. Now, everybody says, yeah, but they're not doing it. Well, yeah, okay, they're not doing it. Why? Well, because the government does it. Again, government crowds out private enterprise. The government sets healthcare standards, so insurance companies don't. Why would they? They just abide by the government ones. What happens when you get government regulations is you get a race to the bottom. You get a race to qualify based on government regulations. Why be better than government regulations? Insurance companies build reputations in a free market, would build reputations over their standards. And you would adjust your risk and calibrate your risk by what kind of insurance company you chose. And insurance companies would be rated, and there would be rating agencies that told you the extent to which these insurance companies are taking risk or not taking risk by having good regulations or not so good regulations, and the market would clear over time. And you'd find, based on supply and demand, like everything in the market, that you would get the kind of optimal risk-return type of regulations. And the market would determine them, not some arbitrary set of government regulators. So regulation lowers standards. Regulations reduce the incentives to monitor, reduce the incentives to build better, to create better, to make better. You just do the basic that the government requires. And then insurance companies just say, okay, if you qualify, if you did what the FDA did or what the FAA did or whatever the government required, that's fine. We're good with that. That's good enough for us. Good enough for us. Now, so the regulations that the insurance companies would provide or that the market would provide, and there might be new mechanisms that arrive. For example, there might be rating agencies that rate space travel companies. They would rate airlines. They would rate drugs. The quality of the drugs, the efficacy of the drug, and the safety of the drug. And you would get ratings, and doctors would get ratings, and they would make decisions based on these ratings. And there would be competing agencies. They're competing rating agencies. That's on top of the insurance companies. So the beauty and by the way, one of the ways, electric products, how come every time you plug a product into the wall socket, it doesn't blow up and you don't get electrocuted? Indeed, if you look at deaths from electrocution over the last 100 years, 120 years since we electrified, it's a steady graph downwards, really sharp downwards. And most of that is a concept of private regulation, private certification. Very little government regulation, mostly private certification and regulation. One of Freeman also says consumer reports. There'd be all kinds of consumer report rating agencies. Who knows how it would exactly evolve? I mean, you would get the Yelps. And I know I saw the leftists going, the companies would buy up and they would write positive reviews for themselves and they would pay people to write positive reviews for themselves. But Yelp has a massive incentive not to let that happen. Because if that happens, nobody's going to use Yelp, nobody's going to advertise in Yelp, and Yelp goes out of business. So again, you get this spiral, you get this feedback effect in markets that you don't have with government regulations. If government regulations are bad, what happens? Well, you get more stringent regulations. And if those fail, what happens? You get even more stringent. And what if those more and more stringent regulations don't work because they're looking at the wrong problem? They're focused on the wrong issue. This happens in banking all the time. We get new regulations. Every bank crisis, we get new regulations and new regulations. And it doesn't stop bank crises from happening. We've had 12 since the founding of America, in spite of ever growing, ever increasing quantity of regulation. Indeed, unregulated markets would never have 12 banking crises. So the beauty of the marketplace is it adjusts. It doesn't always get it right. It doesn't say there are not going to be accidents. Accidents would happen. But the market, because of supply and demand and because of pricing, will adjust based on the values of individuals, based on the markets, which mean individual values, individual desires, individual wants. Not based on arbitrary decision-making of so-called specialists, of experts at determining what your level of risk should be, what your preferences are, what your values should be. Now, what about the fact that this insurance scheme didn't work 100 years ago, and there were fires and there were all kinds of really nasty events where a lot of people died, and government intervened as a consequence? Well, but accidents are going to happen. Tragedies are going to happen. And if government hadn't intervened, people would have learned from those accidents. Markets would have evolved to solve the problems created by those accidents. And we would have seen a steady increase in safety without any government regulations. And and it actually happens in practice. Absolutely. I'll give you an example. Workplace safety. So people who are big advocates of government regulation of workplace safety always bring out a chart, OSHA chart. OSHA is the Occupation Safety Federal, whatever, right? And they show that from the beginning from when OSHA was established, work safety gets better and better. This is a graph of accidents. Accidents go down and down and down and down and down. They're just getting, the workplace becomes safer and safer and safer. But of course, what they don't show you is the graph of what happened before government regulations were put in place. And before government regulations, workplace, the graph is like this. It goes down. And when OSHA is established, it continues to go down. And OSHA has almost no effect on workplace safety in terms of the trend. The trend is downwards. It's downwards. Why? Because workplace accidents are expensive. Because workplace accidents reduce the incentive of people to work for you. Because workplace accidents cause work stoppages. Because workplace accidents involve insurance payments, and insurance companies don't want it, and insurance companies start supervising the workplace. Workplace accidents cause bad stuff. And on top of that, the fact that no employer wants to hurt his employees. No employer actually wants workplace accidents to happen. I mean, the idea that people who achieve management positions are monsters, who have no problem seeing their workers fall off the scaffolding one at a time and be shuffled off to the morgue and don't care about it, is just absurd. So the fact that people are generally benevolent and don't want to hurt other people, the fact that insurance companies won't insure you unless you engage in certain work practice procedures, the fact that accidents actually are very, very, very costly, what it did is it caused companies to invest heavily in safety well before government intervened, well before government regulations forced them to do it. And indeed, one could make the argument there was probably more innovation in workplace safety before OSHA than after OSHA, because there were more, instead of this is how you do things, this is how you build a scaffold, this is what the government does, you would have different approaches and, in a sense, competition in approaches to see which approaches work best to reduce work safety, to increase work safety, reduce accidents. And that's what happens in markets. That's how markets actually function. So it is absurd. It is absurd to think that the only solution to safety is through the use of government, through the use of regulation, through the use of coercion and force, as if there is no marketplace for safety, which there is, of course. So insurance companies, and we'll get to a building in a minute. We'll get to the building, how you do a building in a minute. But what other market mechanism? There's one other financial mechanism that is usually ignored. So leftists, and Sam Seder did this as well, they complain about limited liability corporations. And the idea is that if a company goes bankrupt, then, so the building collapses, the insurance company has to pay huge amounts of money, but the insurance company goes bankrupt, and there's just not enough money in the insurance policy to pay everybody off. And because of limited liability, you can't go to the owners of the company and pull their wealth. You can only go as far as the corporate entity, right? And what do you do about that? So what do you do about that? Well, what you don't realize is that creates a massive incentive for whom? For whom has an interest in an insurance company never going bankrupt? I mean, shareholders can only lose what they invested. And it's a risky investment. They're well diversified. So you could argue from a finance perspective, shareholders don't care that much if a company goes bankrupt. Indeed, shareholders would like the company to take on as much risk as possible because, their downside is capped. And they're well diversified. So who has an incentive to stop the company from engaging in risky behavior if shareholders don't? Assuming what I just said about shareholders is true, which is not exactly right, but this is the way it's portrayed. Who has an incentive to prevent them from going bankrupt? Well, anybody who's lent the company money. Bondholders, banks who have loans outstanding. And I don't know if you've ever looked at a bond covenant. If let's say I go out and get a construction loan from a bank and I sign one of these massive documents, a lot of what's in that document is the lender restraining what you can do, making sure that what you do is safe, making sure that what you do won't bankrupt you, making sure that you limit your liabilities, that you limit the risk that you take. Bondholders have a massive incentive to make sure that the companies that they buy, that they issue bonds, don't go bust because they lose everything. And bonds are supposed to be safer. They're not in the business of taking huge risks. So bondholders' risk aversion, the nature of the bondholders, the way they write the bond is to limit risk, rein them in. And indeed, I think, again, in a free market, bondholders would be involved before they issued the bond, before they lent the company money, in, quote, regulating that company, in regulating how it was built, the quality that was built. Think about a 30-year bond that's issued. They want to know that this has a life, that this is not going to collapse after 10 years because they'll lose all the investment. And that the nature of bonds is you don't lose your investment. The whole nature of bonds is that you're supposed to be relatively safe. So debt markets are another source of risk reduction in an economy. Now, I find it interesting. It'll be interesting to see. I made some comments on Sam Seder's show, and now every leftist commentator on YouTube is taking my video and commenting and strawmanning and ridiculing what I said. I wonder if they do that to what I just did. I wonder if any of those, like Ben Boogers is supposedly tonight going to critique my appearance on Sam Seder. I wonder if Ben is going to watch some of this, where we actually get into my solutions to these problems, and actually critique this. Now, he could critique it, I'm sure. He would ridicule my belief in markets. He would ridicule my belief in the profit motive, in the selfish incentive of people to reduce risk, in the institution self-regulating. Fine, but that's taking on an actual argument versus taking on a soundbite, which is what he's going to do. So, if any of you want, tweet any of these guys and tell them to listen to this show and to critique this show, to critique actual arguments. Yeah, so Morphing Reality says we can look at places with very rudimentary or non-existent workplace safety today, such as Bangladesh, where you see lots of deaths and fires and things like that. I mean, first of all, you don't see lots of deaths. The reason it makes the news is because it's unusual. Once in a while, there is a fire and a lot of people die. But there's a reason that happens. I mean, Bangladesh, just in terms of its per capita GDP, just went past both Pakistan and India. Bangladesh has a growing economy. It's getting richer. Safety is something only the rich can afford. Safety is not something you can afford when you're poor. So one of the factors that go into reducing workplace injury and workplace death is wealth. The poorer a culture is, a country is, the poorer a society is, the more accidents are going to happen. The more deaths are going to be, the less money is invested in safety because you don't have the money to invest in safety. So if Bangladesh imposed workplace safety at the level of a Western country to a point where none of these accidents ever happened, yeah, fewer people would die of accidents and more people would die of just poverty. Bangladesh would be poorer, much, 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 much poorer. The reality is that a country cannot go from poverty to wealth without going through a phase of sweatshops, without going through a phase of lack of workplace safety, without going through a phase of pollution. There's just no way to have that shortcut. There's just not enough wealth to create clean, great jobs that are completely safe. There's going to be a phase where we're still growing, and this is true of the UK and the US in the 19th century. It wasn't very safe. The insurance companies were not very sophisticated. Much wasn't even insured. You have to go through a phase to get to the point where you can establish safety. But the fact is that in Bangladesh, during these periods, life expectancy is still higher than it used to be. It's still true that they're getting wealthier. It's still true that over time there's less and less child labor. And they will invest in more safety as they get richer. I mean, this is... You could run the empirical study and you can see that safety is highly correlated with wealth per GDP per capita, wealth per capita. The higher the wealth per capita, the more safe what people, and the cleaner the environment, and fewer people in sweatshops, so-called sweatshops, and fewer children working. It has nothing to do with government regulation. It doesn't matter if government regulates, because the government regulates and puts in regulations for safety. And nobody can afford to put in those safety requirements because they're exporting, and if they stop, if their costs rise, then the buyer won't buy. Demand will go down. Then all you do is create a black market. All you do is create factories that are not paying attention to the government regulations. Just like child labor. You had lots of child labor laws in the 19th century. They're completely ignored. Because children needed to work because otherwise they would starve. And their parents needed them to work, otherwise they couldn't feed their children. And because businesses needed cheap labor, and children were cheap labor. But as soon as children were not that productive, so as soon as businesses increased productivity of labor, and children couldn't match up, they were fired. As soon as parents got wealthy enough, they pulled the children out of the sweatshops. That happens in every country when it achieves, and I can't remember the exact number, but achieves a certain level of GDP per capita, children disappear from the workplace. Safety goes through the roof. Pollution declines. Because now you have the wealth to invest in it. So yes, in poor countries, one of the reasons you don't want to be a poor country is there are abuses of workplaces. There are really bad safety records. There are people doing horrible things. And my guess is that the most horrible things are being done in the black market. because it's illegal. Whereas if you didn't have the regulations, you allowed for actual competition, it wouldn't have to be a black market. You would have higher safety standards and you would get faster economic growth, faster wealth creation, and faster attainment of a level of wealth that allowed for proper safety, lower pollution, and no child labor. But again, we live in a world in which we expect every country to have our standards like this. And by doing that, by demanding that they do that, we cause them more damage. We don't help them. We're actually hurting them and causing them real suffering and real damage. Now let's take a building that is being built on, in a place like coastal Miami. This is very coercive and a tough place to build a building, particularly if you want it to last a long time. Well, in a free market, how would that be regulated? How would that be controlled? Who has an incentive to build safe buildings? Now, you'd say the builder does because they have a reputation. And people would say, but wait a minute, the building might collapse in 40 years. By then, the builder's dead, right? And there's truth to that. But of course, one of the beauties of corporate entities is they don't die after 40 years, that they're around for a long time, that they build a reputation, they build reputational capital. One of the huge advantages of having corporate entities is their longevity and therefore their long-term incentives to build for the long term. So, buildings are probably going to be better and safer if they're built by corporate entities that are not likely to die when the founder dies, that are likely to survive and likely to continue and likely to build on reputational capital over time. So the builder has some incentive, certainly has some incentive in the short run, and probably has some incentive in the long run. And I'll just say this, even though I think a lot of people will poo-poo it and roll their eyes and so on. No builder wants to build buildings that collapse, just, again, a sense of pride. Nobody builds buildings in order to kill people. Nobody enjoys, very few people, very, very few people luckily in our world enjoy killing people, do things that are unsafe on purpose, to endangering lots of people. I mean, it happens. And again, bad stuff happens and there's no way to eliminate it. Bad people exist. There's no way to eliminate them through government coercion or through the marketplace. Some bad does exist. But at the core, people are not like that. Most people are not like that. So mostly it doesn't happen. What else? Well, buildings have to buy insurance, should buy insurance. I wouldn't buy a condo in a building that didn't have insurance, that wasn't covered by insurance. Insurance companies would have a huge incentive to send in inspectors on a regular basis every time an insurance policy was renewed, maybe every 5 years, every 3 years or whatever. In a coastal area where there is coercion, where there is more deterioration, they would have an incentive to send it in more frequently. Again, insurance company doesn't want to lose money. Doesn't want to lose money. And depending on how the policy is written, it has a huge incentive to warn the owners of the building that these things are problematic, and if these things happen, the insurance won't cover them because it's the responsibility of the building owner to fix the problem. And this is another point, I trust the insurance inspector much more than I've talked about this with food, much more than I trust the government inspector. What's going to happen if the government inspector gets it wrong? What is going to happen in Seaside or whatever to the government inspector who said, this isn't that big of a deal? I mean, maybe he'll lose his particular job. He'll probably go and work for another government agency. But it's pretty rare that inspectors lose their jobs. Maybe because this got a lot of press, he will. But every time there's an outbreak of food stuff, does somebody at the FDA lose their job? Every time a drug turns out to be not as good as the FDA says it is, does somebody at the FDA lose their jobs? Unlikely. These are government employees with tenure. What happens to a private company that screws up? well, they go bankrupt. They fire their employees. Thank you, DDV Show, for the contribution. And yes, please show your support, value for value, through the super chat. I very much would appreciate that. If you appreciate what I'm doing, if you appreciate what I say, if you appreciate my effort in trying to get these ideas out there. Of course, so insurance companies would regulate, would send inspectors, would have the proper incentive, and insurance companies that did a bad job of that would go out of business. Governments don't go out of business, even when they do a terrible job. And you think that you think contractors and insurance companies have short, time frames that they worry about? That's a joke. The people who really have a short time frame are politicians. Senators maybe have 6 years. Maybe they start running a year early, so really 5 years before they have to appease the people who vote for them and the people who give them money. Congress, they only have 2 years incentives. Mayors have to worry about 4 years. Most elected officials have the shortest of time spans. They don't think long term, they think short term. Government generally is an institution that thinks short term, not long term. Okay. Yes, please like the show, thumbs up if you like the show. There should be a lot more likes right now than there are. It helps algorithms. It helps promote the show. So thank you for doing that. So the builder himself, his reputation, his, call it benevolence in some sense, insurance companies, the people who fund the building, the people who buy the condos in the building. Imagine a world in which the government didn't have inspectors. There weren't regulations on building codes. Would people buy willy-nilly these properties without having an inspection? I mean, when we bought a condo, an inspector went in and did a whole massive report about all the different problems with the condo. Now, if the condominium didn't have insurance, if there weren't government regulations around the building of the building, then I would have demanded a separate inspector, like a civil engineer, go in and inspect the foundations, inspect the retaining walls, give an engineering opinion. Or I would demand before I bought the condo that the seller provide me with that, or that the seller provide me with what the insurance company had recently done and show me an inspection report. So we as individuals in cases like this, now it is elevated, our responsibility. But we all have a self-interested interest in buying safe places, even poor people. The idea that poor people can't do this, they're too ignorant, they're too stupid, they're too poor. I mean, it's just nonsense. Poor people don't care about their lives. People can't do Google searches. Poor people can't request reports, safety. Poor people today are suffering because of government regulation of building. Because government regulation of building is so bad today, particularly in places like California, where very little low-income housing is being built. Because it's not worth building low-income housing. Because the fact is that there's so much regulation on the quality and the type of home to be built, particularly condos, that there is no such thing as low-income housing. According to the government dictates how big the bathrooms will be, how big rooms will be, the quality of the materials being used, not just for safety, but for livability or whatever. So that housing for people who can't afford good, high quality housing is unavailable. And what does that lead? That leads to the homeless crisis we have today. The homeless crisis is, at least to some extent, a consequence of the fact that there is no low-income housing being built. And there's no low-income housing being built, partially because of not in my backyard, partially because the government won't release land and allow through zoning for the building of low-income housing, but also because the building regulations are such that you cannot build low-income housing. There's no such thing. The regulations require you to build middle-class housing. That's the only thing you can build. And that's a big part of the homeless problem. Part of the homeless problem started when in New York City, decades ago, I think this was in the 80s, early 80s, they demolished those massive, ugly, horrible buildings they had built to house poor people. I guess in the 60s, when they or 50s and 60s, when they were doing a lot of social engineering, and they built these low-income complexes. Right? Low-income complexes. And they were horrible and they were condensed. They blew them up, and you can find videos of this, the buildings collapsing and going away. And then they built, and they evacuated all the residents, and I guess they paid them, and then they built these new buildings. And the fact is, these residents couldn't afford the new buildings. They couldn't afford the new condos. And they built the new buildings to government specs, to regulatory specs. And many of those people that were evacuating from those original buildings, who couldn't afford the new ones, either had to leave New York or become homeless. And that's the beginnings of that homeless problem. So it truly is despicable that people advocate for the government involvement in these things. When the government involvement in these things, government involvement in safety regulation has had very little effect on actual safety. And it has a massive negative effect on poor people, on quality, on production, on wealth. So you have the builder, you have the insurance company, and then you have the bondholder and the bank, and then you have the person who buys the condo. Each one of those has a responsibility. Each one of those, for their own selfish, self-interested reason, is going to monitor the quality of the building. All of those combined going to do a better job than the government? Yeah. Is it going to be perfect? Well, there are never going to be accidents. There's never going to be a building coming down. There'll never be a homeowners association that procrastinates about fixing something. Well, of course not. Nothing. You can't achieve 100% safety record. If you try, it's absolutely destructive. It'll be so expensive, nobody will be able to live anyway. Accidents will happen. It's sad. It's tragic. It's unfortunate. People will die, and they don't deserve to die. And by the way, I never said in the interview that anybody deserved to die. But that's the way the left spins these things. It just shows you how ugly they are. I said that the people who make the decision should be the people who suffer the consequences. And their children, it's tragic and sad, but children suffer the consequences of adult decisions. But I shouldn't make decisions and then not suffer the consequence. Somebody else suffer the consequence of my decisions, which is what happens with government. All right. I think we've covered most of that. I don't know if you guys had any particular questions around this. Super Chat is open. We've got very, very little Super Chat today. I don't know, less than $100, I think, which is pretty pathetic. It's gonna disappoint. Well, it won't disappoint Alejandrina because it just reinforced the fact that I need her because you guys don't support me financially unless she's on the show. So if you like the show, if you like what I've said, if you think this is important, if you think getting these ideas out there into the world is important, please show your support in the Super Chat right now. I'd appreciate that. Oh, wait. Okay, so let me go through the Super Chat questions we have. I heard these rockets don't have to be highly regulated as long as they aren't paying passengers. Why is that? Well, because, there's no... So the assumption is that the people right now that are flying them know the risks, understand the risks. There's not going to be backlash if some pilots die. Government is concerned with public perception, with backlash, with liability. If it's paying passengers now, if they get killed, then there's going to be backlash. There's going to be demand for the government to do something. The liability is really an issue of the insurance companies. It's not an issue of other stuff. So it's not an issue of the government. But I think it's more an issue of public perception. It's more an issue of pressure from the public and government presenting themselves as we can do something about this. I think at this point they're keeping hands off because there's nothing for them to gain by regulating this. There's nothing for them to lose by accidents happening right now. But once civilians start dying, then suddenly it becomes an issue for them. Meet Kevin, running for Cali governor, was recently on Value Entertainment podcast, sharing his plans and ideas. If he was to win, would love your analysis. I'll look for that. I haven't heard of this guy running for governor. I assume you're sending this because you think he's good, but I'll try to look it up and see what I think. Let's see. Landon, when is Gina coming back? I don't know. I don't have a schedule. There are some missing super chat. I will get to them hopefully. With Gina, sometime in the next few months, I'll have her back on. There's still a bunch of other people I'd like to invite on, and there's just limited time. Plus, I'm traveling a lot this next month, so when I stop traveling, I'll have her on. You win every debate, but do you think you get too competitive and challenging every point head on instead of refraining to more principled points? So here's the challenge. I think particularly with the Sam Seder stuff, I should have tried to reframe to more principled points. I think that was my weakness in that debate. I mentioned that yesterday. But I find that people who try to just constantly reframe and change the conversation come off as evasive, come off as weak because they won't address the particular point. What I try to do in my debates, and I don't succeed in every debate, and maybe some debates are better than others, or maybe you think I never do it, but I think I do, is I try to address the point and reframe the debate at the same time. At least present some kind of sense in which you reframe. It doesn't always work. It depends on who I'm debating with, and it depends on how much they keep going back to the same issue and the same concrete. But it's hard on the fly to do. But I think if you don't actually address the issues, then you come across as evasive, and I don't want to do that. And remember, again, I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to get people to consider a different point of view, to be interested in a different point of view. What do you think of the WHO and the CDC? Should there be a united voice on pandemic matters or disease in general? So I don't think there should be one on disease in general. I think it's a huge mistake to have one on disease in general. I do think there needs to be something of the equivalent of the CDC for a variety of reasons. One is I think it should be part of the Defense Department primarily, partially because biological weapons are a real issue, and the government should be preparing and should be prepared for imagine if COVID had actually been unleashed by the Chinese government. Well, there needs to be a response from the United States. There needs to be a defensive response. And ultimately, there needs to be an offensive response. But that's for another time to talk about what that would be. But there needs to be a defensive response. And I think there should be a CDC that is involved in defending us from biological weapons, but also from viruses, because I think viruses, because they happen through human beings, because they are carried by human beings, the human being who carries the virus is potentially violating other people's rights, and there is a role for government to monitor and screen. Now, I don't think government needs to do more than, I've said this all along, test, trace, isolate. So you isolate the people who carry the virus. That's it. That's what the government is supposed to be doing. I think vaccine production, vaccine distribution, I think testing, creating of testing, all of that should be done by the private sector. What the CDC should do is make it possible for the government to identify deadly viruses and to set in motion the testing, tracing, isolating, and that's pretty much it. The WHO is valuable, and I think the WHO in a rational society would be just a kind of an agency that combined, that would be representatives of the CDCs of every country, and its purpose would be, because viruses cross borders, viruses don't know what borders are, just to share information, to share knowledge, and to be able to more effectively combat these diseases. So it would be primarily information agencies rather than these agencies that provide guidance. And then if you look at the WHO and you look at their mandate today, their mandate has to do with health more broadly, diet, what treatments are good or bad. None of that should be a government entity. All of that should be left to the private sector and private agencies that provide information to individuals. It should just be focused on, quote, protecting individual rights, which means protecting us from viruses, which means knowing a lot about viruses, identifying when a pandemic is happening, and getting information to people in different parts of the world about viruses and their movement, their expansion, their variants, and so on. So it's a coordinating body with no power. It's a body that provides information, but no power to coerce and no power to create. Much less powerful than the CDC or the WHO are today, and which are much narrower mandate. That's how I see it. I think today these agencies have way too big of a mandate. And then when the pandemic happened, one of my big gripes against the Trump administration is when the pandemic happened, the CDC was ignored. And then the CDC had the responsibility of developing tests, and it failed completely with that. But it should have never had that responsibility. It should not be allowed to develop tests. It should be purely an research and informational agency that provides information about viruses, and then let the testing be developed by private enterprise, and then the CDC would guide the isolation and at what level and when isolation needs to be happening when you have a contagious virus. So limited powers, limited scope, limited ability to act. That's what CDC and WHO should be. Is there, Costin asked, is there anything like common goods? If yes, what are the best incentives to finance them? So you mean like infrastructure and things like that we all have an incentive because we all share them. I mean, I don't think any of them are literally common goods in that sense. The incentive to build infrastructure is that you can charge for its use. The incentive to build infrastructure is that you get to use it. The incentive to build infrastructure is that you can make a profit building it. And there are various ways in which we can structure marketplaces in order to facilitate that. But, you let the market work. Now, it's true that often when you build these kind of things, there are free riders. There are people who benefit from your massive investments, who don't pay fully for the use. But so what? The main thing is that either you make a profit, or the main thing is that you get to use the infrastructure that you built. So no, I don't think public goods, there are no such things as, there are such things that we all benefit when somebody invests in X. Like, we all benefit from having an educated public, from people being educated. The world is a better place when people are educated. But does that mean the government should provide it? No, and you get an inferior product when the government does. So does that mean that what we want is profit making, or non-profits? It doesn't matter. Profit in the monetary and non-monetary sense. We want individuals incentivized to provide education privately through the profit motive or through their own goodwill, rather than having one-size-fit-all education. And yeah, it's a public good, but it's lousy, so we all suffer the consequences of having a lousy. But it's only public good because we all benefit from private action. But we all benefit from lots of private action. We all benefit from Steve Jobs. Even if you've never used an Apple in your life, you've benefited from the fact that Steve Jobs was around and he moved forward technology, and he made the world safer, and he made the world more productive, and he made the world richer, even if you never use an iPhone. Okay, this looks like the final super chat, and so if you still want to ask a question, or if you still want to support the show, now's the time. I'm actually going to skip the section on Afghanistan. We'll do that tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll do some stuff about the Biden administration, so we'll include Afghanistan in that show tomorrow. All right, I was thinking of creating a YouTube channel around applying objectivist philosophy to lifestyle and fitness. Thoughts or concerns in going this route? I mean, the only thing you need to be careful of is the extent to which you have objective knowledge about these things. Lifestyle and fitness, well, what about them is optional? What about them is universal? What about them is objective? Do we have an objective theory of fitness? So, does it depend on the individual? Does it depend on individual's lifestyle, the fitness? Does the fitness depend on the individual's genetics? So the only point I want to make is that it's hard to be objective about these things. I think it would be incredibly valuable, but you've got to find a way to be objective. And even if you believe in a certain lifestyle or a certain level, type of fitness program or certain level of fitness, is it appropriate for everybody? Is it absolutely scientific? Do you know that? So just the right word is objective. Capture it. Be objective about your level of knowledge and about the universality of what you're arguing for. Theme Master, thank you for the support, even though you don't have a question. I appreciate that. Jennifer has a question, $20. Thank you. Aren't there already all kinds of government building codes, regulations? Why do these guys think that they didn't stop the building from falling? Because we didn't have enough. So there are lots of building codes, lots of building regulations. There were building inspectors from the government going in there, some who warned, I guess some who said it wasn't too bad. And what they always want is more. Every time there's a crisis, the problem is we didn't have enough. Every time there's a bank crisis, we need more regulations. Maybe the bank crisis was caused by the perverse incentives that the previous regulations created. No, we need more. And if the government owned the buildings, do you think there'd be more or fewer accidents? I think there'd be more. So I think there'd be less accidents without the regulations. I think there'd be fewer accidents without government regulations today. I'd still be for no government regulations, even if there were more accidents. But I think I have little doubt that there would be less accidents. I think there'd be less banking crises without bank regulations. Corey asks, all the way from Australia. So just to finish up on Jennifer's. I mean, time and time again, it's always, whatever happens is always blamed on there's not enough government regulation. And the reason for that is fundamentally people don't trust the self-interested motive. The thing about the marketplace that people reject is what Adam Smith celebrated. It's the invisible hand. But it's the fact that Adam Smith presented it as an invisible hand and didn't explain it. And it's the fact that Adam Smith presented it as the baker bakes his bread for himself. He presented it as self-interest. That's what people don't trust. People don't trust self-interest. And Adam Smith didn't trust self-interest. If you read Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith is super reluctant to attribute the success of the market to self-interest because he thinks self-interest is evil and bad, or at least morally neutral at best. Moral people rise above self-interest, according to Adam Smith. And yet somehow in the marketplace, there's this invisible hand that takes our self-interest and turns us into something moral and good. Nobody believes that. So that they require something to constrain self-interest, to eliminate self-interest. They have to have a bureaucrat with a common good. Now, I don't trust the building inspector because the building inspector has no incentive, has no motivation, much more likely to be bribed than a private inspector. who is going to lose his job if it doesn't happen. Jacob says, general support. Thank you, Jacob. Also, you put the location and name of your condo in yesterday's videos. You might want to edit it out. It's not hard to find where I live. I'm not worried about that. All right, Corey asks, Yaron, I'm scared. We have apparently all been brainwashed by the Koch brothers. Is this true? Is it true? I mean, would you know if you were brainwashed? To what extent does a brainwashed person know that they've been brainwashed? And you know, the truth is that I've actually met Charles Koch. I actually spent 2 hours in conversation with Charles Koch. I actually like Charles Koch. I actually think Charles Koch is a good guy and has done good for the world. I actually am willing to defend Charles Koch. And let me be clear, I don't get any money from Charles Koch. Now, me personally, that ministry gets a little bit, nothing significant with regard to its total budget. But I had actually, John Allison and I met with Charles Koch years ago, 10, 12 years ago, had a great conversation with him, incredibly knowledgeable, smart, thoughtful, unfortunately not principled enough with regard to free markets and regard to objectivism, certainly in Ayn Rand. But no, I mean, that's ridiculous. First of all, they have a villain in Charles Koch they created him into a villain. He's supposedly, we got Donald Trump supposedly because of Charles Koch, but Charles Koch opposed Donald Trump all through. He was anti-Donald Trump from the beginning, and yet the left, it's like the right does with George Soros. They don't actually look at everything's a conspiracy. Everything can be explained by one guy. We're brainwashed by Charles Koch, or we're bribed by Charles Koch, or instead of looking at the ideas and actually analyzing them, they're too lazy to do that. That's true of the left, and it's also true of the right when everything is George Soros. This is George Soros. That's true. George Soros funds it all. Well, actually, read George Soros, see what George Soros advocates, and attack it. He's a bad guy. He's evil. But the idea that it's all if George Soros went away, there would be no left. No, I mean, it's the ideas that are the problem, not the individuals. So no, we haven't been brainwashed by Charles Koch. Indeed, Charles Koch, you could argue, was brainwashed by Ayn Rand. I mean, he when I met with Charles Koch, it was clear that he'd read a lot of Ayn Rand. He knew who Leonard Peikoff was. He knew who John Ridpath was. He had listened to a ton of objectivist literature. You could argue that it's objectivist to brainwash Charles Koch, and then Charles Koch brainwashed the rest of the world. So actually, it's objectivists who are responsible for the state of the world. I never met David Koch, but I do know Charles Koch. Now, recently, I think they sold out. The Kochs have sold out and have abandoned the advocacy of true free markets. I think they decided they had failed, and they just moved on. But if anything, it's ideas that create the people like Koch, and so we're all brainwashed by Milton Friedman, by von Mises, by Hayek, and most of all by Ayn Rand. And she and all of those others brainwashed Charles Koch, according to this brainwashing theory. No, its ideas influence people. There are plenty of people that apply science to fitness, but few they apply morality. The theme would be more around getting the most out of life. That'd be great. I think I'm all for more shows that focus on applying objectivism to your life and applying science to it and doing it right and doing it well. And yeah, I think it would be great. I think, just be careful not to be dogmatic. And again, to be objective. Just find out about objectivism. I appreciate your work. Also, have you heard about the censorship of Dr. Corey and Brett Weinstein on the topic of ivermectin? Now, I don't think YouTube censors. I've said this often. Private enterprise doesn't censor. The only entity that actually censors is government. They have been, they have been restricted in speaking by places like YouTube. YouTube has limited their ability to post on YouTube. And I think that's sad, and I think that's tragic, and I think that's bad. I'm not a fan of ivermectin. I'm going to leave that to the scientists, and I've looked at it. The research I've done, it's questionable, and it's being used all over the world. So we should have very strong scientific proof that it works, given how many doses of it have been given to people with around COVID. So I think it's wrong that YouTube took Brett Weinstein's video down. I think it's wrong that they present themselves as experts on healthcare and try to monitor our healthcare and try to tell us what drugs we can and cannot use and so on. That's not their responsibility. It's not their job. They shouldn't be doing it, but they have every right to do it. They have every right to do it. So the last thing I want is the government to tell them what they should and shouldn't have on YouTube, and then it becomes censorship, and then it becomes censorship of YouTube. But I did a whole show with about a week ago with Amish Adulja, and you can find that on my channel, where we talk about ivermectin, and we talk about all of these issues. So rather than me saying again what I said back then, go back and just look at Yaron Brook ivermectin, and you'll get the show where I discuss that. Simon asks, thanks Simon, thanks for the contribution. Do you agree that it is a good policy not to invest in any China-related company, even if it is supposedly a Hong Kong company, but under Chinese regulations, who may nationalize it at any time? I'm not so worried about nationalization at any time, but you saw what happened to Didi, and I want to do a show on this, where they changed the regulatory regime, and they basically destroyed this company, and all the American investors who invested in it got wiped out. Now, American regulators can do the same thing, but Chinese regulators are worse and more authoritarian. So I wouldn't invest right now in Chinese companies, even if they're based in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is China now. Hong Kong is no longer an independent entity. So I would definitely not invest in China or Hong Kong related companies, specifically because of the uncertainty right now related to how they're regulating their companies and kind of the destructive nature of the Chinese regime. Andrew asked, leftists demand a world of no accidents, no disease, no wrong choices, action without negatives, but they're okay with negatives under socialism. Yeah, because what they're objecting to is the motivation. Socialism, bad stuff happens, but it was for the common good. It was for a good purpose. It was morally motivated, right? Under capitalism, all actions are self-interested motivated, and that's objectionable. That's essentially, fundamentally objectionable, and therefore, that's what they're really opposed to. So, what are they really objecting to? It's self-interest. It's the idea that your life is yours to live as you see fit, based on your judgment in pursuit of your rational values. That's what they're objecting to. Didn't you do an interview with Michael Shermer? It's not up on his channel. I know. And other interviews he did after mine are up. So I don't know why. Maybe he's delaying. Maybe he decided he doesn't want to post it. I'm going to see him next week at Freedom Fest. I'll ask him. But I am disappointed because I thought that by now it would be up, and I don't understand the delay. So I will ask Michael Shermer next week. And if you guys subscribers to Michael Shermer's show, ask him, where's your interview with Yaron? Didn't you do an interview with Yaron? Because he did. All right, guys, we'll call this a day. I will talk about Afghanistan tomorrow, and went longer than I expected, talking about risk and safety. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you want to support the show, Super Chat is not convenient. The best way to support the show is yaronbrookshow.com/support or Patreon or Subscribestar. Also, don't forget to like the show before you leave. Don't forget to share the shows that I do on social media so we expand the audience. Thanks, everybody, and I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of the Yaron Brook Show. Let me just get this. Bye.